July 1944. A humid rain drizzles through the shattered jungle canopy of Guam. The war in the Pacific has turned ruthless, every ridge, every ravine contested with blood. In the shadows of a hillside cave, hundreds of exhausted Japanese soldiers wait in silence. Their uniforms are torn, many grip rifles with shaking hands. They have been told that Americans show no mercy. They expect death the moment they step outside. Footsteps approach. Not a platoon, not a squad. Just one American Marine. Small in stature, helmet tilted forward, a submachine gun slung casually over his shoulder. His name, Corporal Samuel J. Sammy H. George, barely over 5 feet tall, a warrior who looks nothing like the threat his enemy imagines. He demands their surrender, all of them. His voice is steady, his bluff is unthinkable. And by sundown, more than 800 Imperial Japanese soldiers will lay down their weapons. Not a single shot fired by his hand, a victory so surreal that commanders nearly refuse to believe it. This is the story of how one underestimated Marine turned courage and psychology into a weapon and changed the fate of a battlefield in a single day. A day that can only be understood by first knowing the brutal struggle for Guam. The island of Guam lies in the western Pacific Ocean, the southernmost of the Mariana Islands. Its jungles are dense, its terrain jagged and unforgiving. Before the war, it was a quiet American territory, home to the Chamorro people, a U.S. naval base, and palm-lined coastlines kissed by sun and surf. All of that changed in December 1941. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces stormed Guam. The defenders were outnumbered and under-equipped. A quick but violent struggle followed, ending with the island falling into Japanese hands. Families were displaced. Brutality replaced peace. What was once American soil now became part of Japan's Pacific defensive ring, a fortress protecting supply lines, radio stations, and strategic skis. For over 2 years, Guam remained occupied under strict military rule. Meanwhile, the tides of war shifted across the Pacific. Midway in 1942, Guadalcanal in 1943, the relentless push of island hopping now brought the U.S. closer and closer to the Marianas, and Guam became essential once again. Control of Guam meant airfields for long-range B-29 operations against Japan, a strategic staging ground for further advances north, cutting off Japanese reinforcements and shipping routes, the symbolic reclaiming of American soil. By mid-1944, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps assembled one of their largest amphibious forces yet. Battleships and carriers stretched across the ocean horizon. Thousands of Marines and Army infantry were briefed on a single mission: liberate Guam. On July 21, 1944, the assault began. Amphibious landing craft churned through heavy surf as naval guns pounded coastal gun lines. Marines hit the beaches at Asan and Agat under machine gun fire, scrambling through sand, barbed wire, and swamps. The Japanese defenders, hardened, determined, and well entrenched in caves and bunkers, were prepared to fight to the last soldier. For days, the battle raged. Every hill had to be climbed under fire, every gully could hide an ambush. The tropical heat, the mud, the monsoon rains, nature itself added to the fury. Among the Marines fighting their way forward was a young man few would notice in a crowd, Corporal Samuel J. George, serving with the 22nd Marine Regiment. Small but fearless, he moved through the jungle with the adaptability of a scout and the grit of a frontline rifleman. Despite fierce resistance, American forces gradually gained ground. By early August, the Japanese position began collapsing. Food was scarce. Ammunition was dwindling. The once powerful defensive line fragmented into isolated pockets of soldiers scattered through caves and ravines. Between the U.S. lines and the final ridges of northern Guam, chaos reigned. This is where the war changed from coordinated battle to desperate survival. Small American patrols were dispatched to root out remaining enemy groups, sometimes finding one soldier, sometimes dozens. But intelligence soon reported something far more dangerous: large clusters of Japanese troops, leaderless but armed, still hiding in the wilderness. Any one of those groups could launch a sudden suicidal attack. It was in this fragile moment, when every cave might be a trap, that Corporal George stepped into history. Because while most in his position might have waited for support, George did the opposite. He walked alone toward the caves. And that extraordinary choice is what shapes the next part of the story: the human tension, the mindset, and the desperation that set the stage for an impossible surrender. By August 1944, Guam's liberation was close, at least on paper, but the fight was far from finished. Japanese forces that once numbered over 18,000 had suffered devastating losses. Many officers were dead, communications were broken, command structures shattered, yet thousands of soldiers still hid in the jungles and limestone caves of northern Guam, clinging to the belief that their duty was to die, not surrender. In Imperial Japanese military doctrine, surrender was considered dishonorable. Soldiers were taught that capture was worse than death. Propaganda reinforced this belief relentlessly. Americans were described as brutal invaders who would torture and execute prisoners without mercy. Fear became as powerful as any rifle. And so hunger, disease, and hopelessness drove men deeper underground rather than into American custody. From the U.S. perspective, the situation was alarming. The battle for Guam could not be declared complete while armed enemy forces remained scattered in the hills. At night, sniper fire still snapped through the air. Small banzai attacks erupted without warning. Every Marine patrol risked ambush from troops who had nothing left to lose. American commanders formed clearing patrols, small units tasked with locating and neutralizing these hidden threats, but the terrain worked against them. The caves were labyrinthine. Dense foliage swallowed visibility. One wrong step, and an unseen machine gun or grenade could turn a routine sweep into a massacre. Corporal Samuel J. George was repeatedly assigned to these operations. He wasn't imposing in height or bulk, but he was quick, calm under pressure, and known among his fellow Marines for a willingness to volunteer for tasks others avoided. His size allowed him to move quietly, slipping through narrow jungle passages and dark cave entrances without noise. He understood the psychology of an enemy afraid to surface. He understood the dangers to his comrades if they didn't. And perhaps most importantly, he understood that sometimes one man approaching alone looked less threatening than a squad of Marines approaching with rifles raised. His actions in the days leading up to his famous Bluff showed a Marine who trusted intuition as much as training. Several times, he approached trapped groups of Japanese soldiers and convinced small numbers to surrender. It was rare, it was risky, but it worked. Each success fueled his confidence. Each encounter taught him more about fear, theirs and his. Then came the intelligence reports. A large force of Japanese soldiers, possibly hundreds, was cornered in a series of caves near the cliffs of northern Guam. They were desperate, they were surrounded, and they were running out of food and water. A direct assault could be catastrophic for both sides. Any attempt to flush out the defenders might result in explosive violence, suicide charges, grenades in close quarters, Marines dead at the cave mouth. Someone needed a solution that was faster and quieter. That someone, incredibly, would be one small Marine carrying little more than courage, a Thompson submachine gun, and a voice that demanded to be obeyed. Corporal George's plan would defy logic, military strategy, and the expectations of every officer on the island. But before we reach that moment, we must explore the forces that truly shaped the outcome, not just bullets and explosions, but the 6 angles that converge in this story. Human fear and desperation. Psychological warfare. The terrain and the cave system. Leadership gaps in the Japanese ranks. The Marine Corps tactical doctrine. The individual character of one unlikely hero. Together, These angles explain how the impossible became real. And now, with the stage fully set, we turn to those angles, and the choices that turned a single bluff into one of the strangest victories in Pacific warfare. Human fear and desperation. Inside the caves of northern Guam, Japanese soldiers faced a slow death. Many had not eaten a full meal in days. Tropical diseases spread unchecked. Water came from muddy trickles in the rock, shared among hundreds. The stench of unwashed bodies and decaying wounds filled the air. They were not expecting hope, they were expecting annihilation. For these soldiers, surrender wasn't a strategic option, it was a path into the unknown horror painted by years of indoctrination. They imagined torture, they imagined execution, they imagined a merciless enemy waiting outside with bayonets raised. Fear locked them in place. But fear cuts both ways. The very belief that Americans were unstoppable giants created an illusion that one calm voice could exploit. When Corporal George approached them, alone and assertive, many soldiers assumed he was part of a much larger power just out of sight. Where hunger weakens the body, fear twists the mind. And in that psychological storm, one man wielding confidence could feel like the embodiment of fate itself. Angle 2. Psychological warfare. Warfare often becomes a battle of perception long before bullets fly. The US military invested heavily in intelligence operations that highlighted the benefits of surrender, fair treatment, medical aid, food, and water. Leaflets and loudspeakers informed Japanese troops that captivity did not mean death. But propaganda means little unless someone proves it real. George's past successes with smaller groups made him uniquely capable of bridging the gap between fear and trust. He did not shout threats. He did not fire warning shots. He projected calm authority, a signal that surrender would be respected, not punished. His approach weaponized doubt. Japanese soldiers, already questioning their fate, now received a human answer to their fears. One steady Marine walked into the tension and turned it into submission. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, without a single bullet leaving his gun. Angle 3. The terrain and the cave system. Guam's northern cliffs are riddled with natural limestone caverns, some stretching deep underground. These caves were both sanctuary and trap. They protected Japanese forces from bombardment, but they also isolated them from each other. Communication collapsed. Commanders struggled to control scattered remnants of regiments. From outside, Americans had no clear view into the labyrinth. Every cave mouth seemed to promise hidden fire. Charging in meant death, but waiting invited ambush. George's small size gave him a unique advantage. He could move quietly and squeeze into narrow spaces where larger Marines could not. He understood how caves distorted sound, how a single voice could echo and make one man seem like many. The terrain that once empowered the defenders now became their prison, a prison that could be unlocked with confidence or sealed by panic. In this environment, George's solo approach wasn't just bold, it was perfectly suited to the landscape. Early in the battle, many senior Japanese officers on Guam were killed or cut off from their units. Colonel Takashina, a key commander defending the island, fell during the desperate counterattacks. With leaders gone and radios destroyed, fragmented groups of soldiers had no strategic direction. They acted on rumor, instinct, and fear. A force without leadership becomes a crowd. A crowd without hope becomes unstable. Inside the caves, conflicting whispers spread, reinforcements will come, death before dishonor, the Americans will torture us. No, they might spare us. Loyalty clashed with survival. Corporal George arrived not as a negotiator, but as a symbol of organized power. He represented the structure the Japanese soldiers had lost. The contrast was stark, confusion underground, certainty outside. In such a vacuum, authority, even from an enemy, can become strangely persuasive. For hundreds of starving soldiers, the Marine at the cave entrance suddenly looked like a leader. Angle 5. Marine Corps Tactical Doctrine. U.S. Marine patrols were trained for adaptability. Small unit initiative was a core ethic. On an island with unpredictable resistance, Marines had to think creatively. They learned to read terrain, interpret silence, and act quickly with minimal guidance. Corporal George embodied that doctrine. Rather than relying solely on firepower, Marines on Guam increasingly used bold negotiation to reduce casualties and secure quicker victories. A single surrender could save dozens of Marines and prevent suicide attacks that killed even more Japanese. Risk, when balanced against mission goals, became acceptable, even admired. George's decision to approach the caves alone wasn't just courage. It reflected a tactical evolution in the Pacific War, using the mind where bullets weren't necessary and achieving victory without a single shot. Angle 6, the character of one unlikely hero. Sammy George did not fit the Hollywood image of a dominating war hero. He was short, soft-spoken, and unassuming, but his courage was not measured in inches. It came from a calm conviction, a belief that the right words spoken at the right moment could change fate. Fellow Marines remembered him as someone who never panicked. He treated risk not with recklessness, but with a remarkable sense of control. His size might have made him a smaller target, but his presence made him something much larger, a figure who defied enemy expectations. In war, underestimation can be powerful. The enemy sees weakness until it commands their obedience. George walked into danger not because he wanted glory, but because he understood the cost of inaction. Every life saved by surrender, enemy or ally, was a victory worth seeking. These 6 angles, fear, perception, terrain, fractured command, adaptive tactics, and personal courage, now converge into one singular event. The moment when a lone Marine stood before hundreds of enemy soldiers and convinced them that resistance was over. Now we shift from the forces shaping the moment to the moment itself. August 1944, northern Guam. A dripping silence clung to the entrance of the cave. Marines waited at a distance, rifles trained on the dark opening. They knew what lived inside: fear, hunger, and the fire of men who refused to die quietly. A direct assault could turn the ravine into a graveyard. Then Corporal Samuel J. George stepped forward. No escort, no backup visible beside him, just the weight of responsibility behind him. His commanding officer watched, tense, but trusting the Marines' instinct. George had already convinced smaller groups to surrender earlier in the campaign. But this was different. Reports estimated hundreds inside, perhaps even as many as a full battalion's remnants. Any misstep could trigger explosives, knives, or a final banzai charge that would cost dozens of Marine lives. George inhaled the moist jungle air and adjusted his helmet. He tightened his grip on his Thompson's submachine gun. Then he called out, with authority, in simple, decisive terms the Japanese soldiers would understand: "Surrender, come out, now." His voice echoed through the chambers, bouncing against stone walls and dissolving into the darkness. For several seconds, there was nothing, no movement, no answer. He repeated the demand, still silence. But within that silence, minds struggled. Fear wrestled with instinct. Officers who once commanded now trembled. Everyone inside understood what starvation and isolation meant. They had seen comrades collapse. They had buried men who chose suicide rather than captivity. Now a single American demanded obedience. Minutes stretched. Sweat rolled beneath George's chin strap. His heart pounded, but his stance never changed. Marines behind him wondered if this was madness, if one sudden burst of enemy fire would cut him down. Then a sound. Shuffling, soft voices, the scrape of a boot sliding over rock. At first only a few emerged, thin, weak, hands in the air. Their eyes darted, terrified of hidden Marines they assumed surrounded them. George gestured firmly, directing them toward U.S. patrols who moved in to secure them. More followed. Dozens. Then hundreds. It was not cautious. It was a flow, as if a dam of fear finally broke. Soldiers poured out in groups, some limping, some crying silently, others staring blankly, men who had fought for years now submitting to a stranger's voice. George maintained his position, immovable, commanding. Inside the cave, desperation exploded into compliance. Soldiers who once pledged an oath to die before surrender now crossed into American hands. Their rifles clattered to the ground. Grenades were tossed aside. Medical corpsmen rushed forward to treat the wounded. Corporal George did not shout or threaten, he simply directed. By late afternoon, the count surpassed 500. Commanders were stunned. How could one Marine accomplish what artillery and flamethrowers could not? How did a lone figure extract the surrender of so many hardened soldiers? The truth lay in the psychology he manipulated. If a single American dared to approach alone, it must mean overwhelming power stood behind him. George allowed that illusion to grow. With every new surrender, Japanese morale fractured further. Those inside could not see the number ahead, only the steady procession walking into custody. Every man who chose life weakened the resolve of those who hesitated. The impossible was happening. When the final stragglers emerged, drained of fight and drenched in exhaustion, stunned officers confirmed the count. More than 800 Japanese soldiers surrendered that day to one Marine. By evening, Corporal George stood quietly among piles of weapons, bayonets, rifles, machine guns stacked higher than his own height. Marines around him looked on in disbelief. There was no gunfight, no shouting, just the calm authority of a man who refused to accept unnecessary death. The battle for Guam had not ended, but here, in this ravine, its outcome became undeniable. Yet the story wasn't finished. There was still one more confrontation, one that tested whether this miracle could hold through the night. Dusk crept across the jungle as the last rays of sun disappeared behind Guam's cliffs. The day's unbelievable success spread through Marine lines like a whisper of good news in a war that rarely offered any. But while hundreds of Japanese soldiers lay disarmed and guarded, there were still questions. Was everyone accounted for? Were higher-ranking officers still inside, planning a counterattack? Could the fragile peace shatter with a single shot in the dark? Marine intelligence soon confirmed a troubling reality. Maori soldiers remained hidden in the deepest sections of the caves. These were the most fanatical holdouts, officers, machine gunners, and men who still clung to the honor of death in battle. Unlike the starving masses who surrendered, they had ammunition, grenades, and the will to use them. Commanders weighed their options. Fire and explosives, risk a massacre, wait for daylight, risk a surprise attack in the night. George had already performed a miracle. Asking more of him felt unfair, yet he stepped forward again without hesitation. He approached the cave mouth once more, this time under the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the canopy. The jungle was too quiet. Then from deep within, voices, agitated, loud, argumentative. Some wanted to come out, others wanted to fight. A few insisted they would only surrender to an officer of high rank, someone who could promise fair treatment. What they requested next shocked the Marines. They demanded to speak directly with a U.S. colonel. But no colonel dared walk into a cave full of armed, cornered soldiers. So George made a decision, a bold decision, a dangerous decision. He would become the colonel. He straightened his uniform. He spoke in commanding tones. He projected a stature his small frame did not physically possess. To the unseen men in the deep tunnels, his confidence sounded unmistakably like authority. He called out firmly, "I am the commanding officer. If you surrender now, you will be treated well." There was silence again, long enough that Marines outside feared the bluff had finally reached its limit. Then, a single figure emerged. Not a private, not a laborer, a Japanese officer, sword still at his side. He stared at George, shocked by his height, his youth, his simple corporal's insignia. The truth was obvious. This was no colonel. The officer's face darkened with insult. His pride, and perhaps shame, ignited something dangerous. His hand shot to the hilt of his sword. George didn't flinch. With a voice like sharpened steel, he ordered, "Drop the sword." A long moment passed, breath held across the entire ravine. Then the officer released the blade. It hit the ground with a lonely metallic echo. Mori soldiers followed behind him, one by one at first, then in steady groups. They filed out, defeated but breathing, choosing a slim chance at survival over certain death underground. By the time the final holdout surrendered, the number had climbed past 800 men in total. Marines scrambled to arrange space, water, and medical aid for the unprecedented number of POWs. Piles of surrendered weapons, rifles stacked like firewood, filled the clearing. Only when the last prisoner was secured did the magnitude of the moment set in. A single Marine, barely over 5 feet tall, had just conducted the largest one-man surrender negotiation in the Pacific campaign. There were no medals pinned on him that night, no speeches, just a quiet acknowledgement he had saved countless American and Japanese lives. The caves that once echoed with fear now held only silence. The Northern Guam campaign, one of the most difficult jungle battles of the Pacific, had crossed a threshold. With each surrender secured, the battle shifted from desperate resistance to inevitable American victory. Yet consequences ripple far beyond the battlefield. What happened that day reshaped military understanding of surrender psychology and challenged long-held beliefs about what courage truly looks like. Next, we confront those consequences on Guam, across the Pacific, and deep within the men whose lives changed in a single day. By nightfall on northern Guam, the reality settled in among the Marines. Over 800 Japanese soldiers had surrendered, not to a full squad, not to artillery or flamethrowers, but to a single corporal. The implications rippled immediately through the battlefield. For American forces, the victory was staggering. Every soldier who surrendered was one fewer life lost in combat. Patrols no longer had to risk entering the cave labyrinths blindly. Casualties that could have mounted from suicide attacks, snipers, or hidden machine guns were avoided entirely. One man had prevented potentially dozens of deaths on both sides. Commanders took careful note. The surrender demonstrated the power of psychological leverage, combined with small unit initiative. Doctrine evolved to recognize that patience, intelligence, and understanding the enemy's mindset could achieve what force alone might not. Meanwhile, the Japanese soldiers faced their own aftermath. Many had survived weeks, even months, in near-starvation conditions. Their uniforms were torn, their bodies weak, their morale shattered. For men trained to fight to the death rather than surrender, being captured by a single Marine was both humiliation and salvation. Medical teams moved quickly. Dehydrated, malnourished, and feverish soldiers were treated on the spot. For some, it was their first warm meal in weeks. The juxtaposition was stark. Death had stalked these caves relentlessly, yet life returned quietly through the care of the very enemy they had feared. The impact extended beyond the physical. American soldiers who witnessed the surrender were profoundly affected. Many had fought in brutal combat where every step forward meant a life lost. Seeing courage and wit triumph over sheer numbers reminded them that war was not always won with force alone. Some Marines would later recall the moment as a testament to human ingenuity and nerve rather than firepower. Naval officers and higher command documented the surrender meticulously. Reports described the astonishing numbers, the circumstances, and the absence of violence. Photographs captured rows of disarmed Japanese soldiers, their faces weary but intact, contrasted against the small figure of the Marine responsible. The images circulated in internal briefings, serving as a case study in courage and tactical ingenuity. Yet the victory also carried symbolic weight. Guam had been under Japanese control since 1941. Its liberation was not only a strategic necessity, but also a moral imperative. For American troops, seeing the island slowly return to U.S. hands and watching enemy forces yield without mass bloodshed reinforced the broader significance of their campaign in the Pacific. The surrender altered Japanese defensive posture on Guam as well. Commanders who remained in scattered positions recognized that resistance alone could not guarantee survival. The myth of American ruthlessness was countered by a more nuanced reality. Surrender could preserve life. Even the staunchest holdouts began to question the doctrine that death was preferable to captivity. From the perspective of war historians, this moment illustrated a rare intersection of psychology, terrain, and individual heroism. A single Marine, leveraging both intuition and courage, had forced a dramatic shift in battle dynamics. His actions would later serve as an example of the unpredictable human factors that shape warfare, moments where one mind can change the course of hundreds. As Guam's northern hills quieted and the surrendered soldiers were moved to secure compounds, the larger campaign continued. But the echo of that day, of one man confronting hundreds and emerging unscathed, lingered in the minds of all who witnessed it. The story of the surrender was far from over. The broader effects on Japanese morale, American tactical approaches, and the campaign's momentum would continue to unfold. The consequences reached beyond the immediate battlefield and shaped lessons that would inform Pacific operations for the remainder of the war. In the days following the surrender, the strategic effects became clear. Guam, once a fragmented battlefield, now had its northern approaches secured without a costly assault. The island's recapture enabled American forces to consolidate positions, repair airfields, and stage subsequent operations toward the Marianas. The surrender accelerated the timeline of the campaign, allowing additional forces to redirect attention to other strategic objectives, such as Saipan and Tinian. For the Japanese, the psychological impact was profound. The narrative of infallible imperial resolve had been undermined. Soldiers who had survived the brutal campaign witnessed comrades surrendering en masse, led not by overwhelming firepower, but by a single, unassuming enemy. Even those still in isolated positions began to reconsider their chances. Desertion, previously unthinkable, became a subtle but real consideration among remaining groups. The once absolute code of death before dishonor faced erosion in the face of survival instinct, practicality, and the undeniable display of human cunning. Among U.S. forces, Georgia's action became a study in leadership and small unit initiative. Marine officers incorporated the event into training discussions, emphasizing the role of psychological assessment, communication, and calculated risk in operational planning. The surrender demonstrated that courage, intelligence, and decisiveness could achieve results equivalent to artillery barrages without the cost in lives or resources. This case reinforced a lesson critical to Pacific warfare. Battles are won not only by firepower, but by understanding the enemy's mind and exploiting vulnerabilities in morale. The human dimension extended further. Many Japanese prisoners, once recovered and processed, provided intelligence on troop movements, cave locations, and supply caches. Their surrender directly contributed to the safety of additional marine patrols, reducing the need for hazardous cave clearance operations. Lives were saved, and tactical awareness increased. Georgia's Bluff, initially viewed as an extraordinary gamble, now demonstrated tangible operational value. The impact resonated beyond the military. News of the surrender circulated in briefings and reports, becoming part of the emerging narrative of the Pacific campaign. While the story lacked the spectacle of naval battles or island bombardments, it exemplified the ingenuity and adaptability of U.S. forces. It also challenged conventional perceptions of heroism. Courage did not always reside in brute force or numbers. Sometimes it lived in composure, insight, and the audacity to confront danger with intellect as the primary weapon. For the local Chamorro population, the surrender indirectly reduced the suffering of war. Fewer firefights meant fewer civilian casualties and less destruction of villages and resources. The psychological relief of witnessing the collapse of Japanese resistance without mass bloodshed was profound, a quiet but significant step in reclaiming the island. Ultimately, the surrender highlighted a fundamental truth of war. The interplay of fear, leadership, and perception can determine outcomes as decisively as bullets. Corporal George's actions became a touchstone example in Marine Corps history, demonstrating how individual initiative can alter the trajectory of a campaign. The surrender on Guam was not merely an isolated incident. It represented a confluence of preparation, intelligence, courage, and timing that forever altered the Pacific Theater's operational landscape. With the battle for the northern caves resolved and the island's liberation increasingly secure, historians and Marines alike would later reflect on the extraordinary convergence of human factors that produced such an improbable outcome. The surrender was complete, the immediate danger neutralized, and yet the broader implications for strategy, morale, and the understanding of courage endured far beyond the jungle of Guam. The stage was now set for reflection on what this event truly meant, not just as a tactical victory, but as a profound example of human ingenuity and the moral complexities of war. The surrender of over 800 Japanese soldiers to a single Marine defies conventional notions of warfare. It was not brute force that prevailed, but courage, intuition, and the careful reading of human fear. Corporal Samuel J. George's actions remind us that the battlefield is as much a theater of the mind as it is of bullets and explosions. One man's confidence, presence, and understanding of the enemy's psychology can tip the balance in ways that sheer numbers cannot. In that moment on Guam, the rules of war shifted subtly but profoundly. The Japanese soldiers, trained to embrace death rather than submission, found themselves confronted not with annihilation, but with the possibility of life. The Marines, trained to overcome with firepower, witnessed that discipline, calm, and decisiveness could achieve a victory that no artillery barrage could guarantee. The human element, the courage to face fear, and the wisdom to manipulate perception became the decisive weapon. Beyond strategy and tactics, the event speaks to the broader truths of conflict, that bravery does not always roar, sometimes it whispers, that leadership is measured not only in orders issued, but in trust inspired, that even in war's most brutal moments, lives can be preserved through ingenuity and moral courage. One Marine, underestimated by both enemy and allies, embodied these truths in a single day. The surrender on Guam offers more than a historical footnote. It offers a lens through which to examine human behavior in extremis. It challenges assumptions about strength, authority, and the dynamics of fear. It reminds us that the course of history often hinges on unpredictable, individual choices, moments when one person steps forward and reshapes the fate of many. As the sun set over the jungle ridges and the surrendered soldiers moved into the care of the Marines, the island slowly returned to American hands. The rifles were stacked, the caves were empty, and in that quiet, one small figure stood as a testament to the extraordinary power of courage, wit, and determination. In the endless expanse of war, where countless acts of heroism go unrecorded, this one improbable day endures, a story of how one tiny Marine, with nothing but a bluff and unshakable resolve, changed the fate of hundreds.